I am going to kick it over to Gianina, who is going to facilitate our Equity Champion Consultant panel. We have a team of 3 fabulous people who are going to talk a little bit more about equity, particularly in the state context, which can be really challenging at times. So Gianina.
Thank you. And yes, you're 2 minutes over. So we reserved 2 minutes at the end of this in the event that we need it. But thank you all for joining. I'm excited that some of our equity champions, I think many of you have already had the opportunity to meet some of them. Obviously, these are the same equity champion consultants who wrote those briefs and recorded podcasts that you have access to. And they were designed to address some of the barriers that were perceived in fostering culturally sustaining pathways. And so we ask, as we enter into this next leg of the work from you all, right? What are some barriers that we have yet to address? As they're talking, as they're conversating, right? Feel free to type it in chat. If you're uncomfortable typing it and sending it out to the group, send it to me and I'll put it in chat for everyone to see. But definitely want you to at least engage while we are having this conversation. This was one that we saw very worthy of a discussion as it's so recent, right? You saw the title, Resisting Racial Equity While Trying to Diversify Pathways, Navigating State Socio-Political Contexts. At a time where so many of us are in institutional and state contexts that are highly volatile, as Dr. Reddick said, maybe even reactionary, right? We're interested in finding ways to build coalitions and debunk misinformation. Thus, you see the equity champions before you into a conversation, right? We're hoping that this is a conversation that you all get a chance to lean in, listen in on, but also be a part of, right? About how they're doing racial equity work from their perspective, state context, et cetera. So thank you to Drs. Susana Munoz of Colorado and Dr. Richard Reddick, Texas, and Dr. Felecia Commodore of Virginia for joining us this might be your morning or afternoon in this focused discussion. So I'm just going to jump in with the very first question. And they'll take it off and join it into a conversation. So we'll start with Dr. Munoz. What are the benefits of racial equity work and how can we invite others into these efforts under a climate of resistance?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak and for the conversation. I mean, I think all of us in this space can agree that there are many benefits of doing this work, and it's an imperative. It's a moral imperative to prepare sort of the workforce in a way that really can meet the needs of our demographic, our changing demographic. But we also are working under our different social political contexts, and to really understand that, you know, in addressing that in particular, we need to understand the impact that it has on our institutions, that it has on our students, that it has on our faculty and staff, and the way that we engage in these conversations. And so one of the things that, you know, I come under the work with undocumented and DACA students, you know, for the last, 15 plus years. And so this has always been sort of an imperative for us. And so to really understand sort of like the benefits, we have to understand that equity is not necessarily diversity, right? And so diversity means something different than equity. Equity is more of understanding sort of like the structures and systems that are entrenched within, white supremacy and that continue to exist in our institutions. So when you think about going beyond sort of like numerical compositions of our university, we need to really think about how do we teach critical thinking? How do we do self-examination of ourselves? Of, how do we provide space to do that with our students? And also, how do we also question and making sure that we're not mistaking training for education as well? So I think those are sort of the overarching, ways that I think about the benefits of equity, but also, understanding that, and I live in Colorado, and so I think we have to I'm just because I live in a state that doesn't necessarily have a governor passing these anti-woke laws doesn't mean that there's not that behavior and that practice with entrenched in some leadership, and not only on the state political level, but also at the institutional level. And so when we think about, on a micro level, I'm thinking more about like how, how do we, provide engagement? How do we provide connection, for our students to really be talking about these issues, but also, addressing sort of the social political context in ways that we name it, and how do we, lead with courage in some of these conversations. So I'm going to let my colleagues also jump in too.
Yeah, I echo many of those sentiments. I think particularly and within my state context in Virginia, I think doing this equity work, even under resistance, which is, we have this kind of mixed situation going here where we have a gubernatorial administration who is showing resistance towards kind of equity and things of that nature. But then a state senate that kind of is trying to push forward legislation that moves equity forward, right? So there's tension in which direction should we be moving the state, right? And so, but I think doing equity work is going to be really important within our context, because if we're trying to grow as a state, become more competitive, it's going to be necessary to be able to service well and provide opportunities for a diverse group of folks across the state. Our state has urban areas, it has rural areas, it has Appalachian kind of mountainous areas, we have coastal areas, and so there's different needs and different kind of investments that have to be made in order for all those communities to be thriving, particularly in the area of higher education. And so I think it's really important, if we're thinking about how do we lift the state up, right? That all of those different groups are being serviced in equitable ways, right? And that we don't become kind of lopsided in the ways in which who is getting the benefits of return from their investment as citizens of the state. But I think on a micro level of thinking within our institutions, because I think often we think about it on kind of this macro competitive level, but I think on an institutional level, I just think really focusing on equity work is what makes your institution kind of have some stability. When we engage in work that is, or we engage in executing our mission in ways that have inequitable outcomes, whether it's for students or staff, or faculty, that is where we open the door for burnout. We open the door for, attrition. We open the door for people feeling like they're not valued, which leads to turnover and burnout, apathy. And these are all things that eventually will hurt the ability for your institution to continue to serve at an optimum level and perform at an optimum level. And ultimately, that has long-term effects, whether it is acquiring funding, whether it is attracting donors and partners, whether it is sustaining and increasing enrollment. All of these things are impacted. And so I think that often when there are resistance to equity on kind of an institutional level, it's this idea that in order for one group to gain, another group has to lose. And so we come up with these kind of resistance to these false zero-sum games, right? But the reality is that if we are focusing on making sure we have equitable outcomes, what we're actually focusing on is investing in having a more a more robust kind of system going on that actually will be attractive both internally and externally, which helps some stability in the long-term kind of life of your institution. And particularly for public institutions, our when we have our gubernatorial administration changes every 4 years. And so we can't always be going with the whims of the political scene. So really investing in something that, regardless of how the winds change up at the state capitol, we are able to have some stability and continue to grow and service our constituencies well at our institutions.
I would just want to co-sign to Susana and Felicia's wonderful comments. I agree 100%. And I guess on the other end of the continuum, I'm in the state of Texas, actually physically in California right now. I don't know why it's so cold here, but it is. But, you know, my state is, you know, a conservative state with a conservative legislature. Actually, population-wise, I would argue that point, but nevertheless, representationally in the legislature, that's what we look like. It's right now session in Texas. Legislative session, which means a plethora of news items I'm sure you've all heard of. And I have some colleagues, Cynthia, and I see Christine here from Texas. My colleagues from UT, from Texas are here too. You know, we're kind of in the middle of all of the tumult, whether it's CRT or DEI, sort of anti legislation is popping up. And, you know, I think what I would make the point of is one of the important things we have to do is think about how we both frame and reframe the work that we're doing. You know, equity, diversity, inclusion work is critical work. It's important work. It's affirming work. It's social justice work. It's also economically competitive work, right? So we have to be conversant in all those ways of talking about it. And so sometimes when the conversations start, there's already a perception that we know that this is what we're talking about, these things. And they'll take a couple of examples of things they find egregious, when in fact, we should be talking about the breadth of work that we do in these spaces. I'm often reminding people that DEI work supports rural students, first-gen students, students with disabilities, student veterans, you know, making sure there's a clear understanding. And also is intersecting identities, right? So it's not simply a student has one identity. They have multiple identities that they hold, right? And at certain points in their journey, they're going to need support navigating spaces with all of those things. And the funny thing is, when I start talking to people about these things, when we get away from the hot lights and the, you know, the social media, you know, 280 word, letter, character responses, people are actually, okay, yeah, I think that's actually a good idea, or I actually think that's important, right? So part of it is really sort of, and I'm actually talking to you as somebody who's trying to understand and learn and do this better, is really engaging with people who are perhaps not where I'm at on this whole issue when it comes to working on racial equity issues, but seeing, and I'm going to use a CRT concept from Derek Bell, interest convergence. Are there places that we have similar goals and outcomes that we can work together? And the funny thing is that, you know, when you do that, that's being pragmatic. It's also CRT at work, right? So it's so interesting that that's not understood. But honestly, you know, I often talk to. I was recently in a group of folks in a fundraising event, and I said, you know, our work is about maximizing human potential, and I said that's what we do at the university. We maximize human potential, and people are like, yes, I agree, and I'm like, I'm basically telling you DEI stuff right now. That's what I'm talking about, right? Because that means that we're meeting every student where they come to the institution, and we are supporting and scaffolding their growth. That's what we're doing, right? And I think it's important that we sort of talk about the breadth of work we do and not limit it to the things that catch their eyes. At the same time, we have to be resolute and defend, you know, the important and significant work that's being done to support marginalized populations. Like, to me, it's not backing away from that, but it's saying we do that work, but we do work in spaces that you probably don't think we do work in. And, you know, we can point to, we all have the examples, right, of students, groups of students, you know, communities that we know have benefited immensely from the work that we do. And so I think reminding people that those are always out there is super important. And then more importantly, attaching our collective well-being to it. You know, I mentioned the issues of social justice, economics, and we just had this, you know, Felecia, Susana, and Gianina and I, we all had this great conversation before we met with y'all about implications for this work, right? We want to be world competitive, right? We want to be, the Boyer report talks about, you know, world readiness, right? So how can you be world ready if you're not exposed to the panoply of perspectives, viewpoints, experiences that exist, right? We're talking about cold hard cash here. We're not talking about, you know, I'm a lefty, I'm a lib, right? I believe in social justice, but I can talk to people who don't believe in those issues and at least find a convergence of interest on that point. Like, this is actually good for our economy. This is good for our state. It's good for our citizens. We should be doing this work intently. And we also need to think about how we talk about the work in different ways that everybody can kind of see a connection to it. So maybe I'm not really 100% comfortable with what you're doing in this space, but this other part what you're doing, I think, makes a lot of sense. And that's where we can start. I think we've kind of lost the ability to sort of work in the thorniness of sort of policy work sometimes and just say, these people are on the wrong side. I'm opting out. And I actually think we need to figure out ways to find those engagement spaces. And it's challenging. Don't get me wrong. I think it's very challenging to be in spaces where you get the sense that people have incredibly different worldviews than you hold. But I always thought from the perspective is like, are we talking about, you know, respecting people's humanity? And honestly, sometimes it's hard to do because some people don't do that. But if we can get to that point, then I can talk to almost anybody about anything. So, you know, just to add to this conversation, I think that's a really critical piece of this, is just learning how to reframe and support the important work we do, but also make sure the work is understood holistically, impacting all students, all community members, and making us a more effective and better learning environment.
What you just brought up was kind of leaning into the next question. And so we're going to do two things at once. For our panelists, right? The question was, you know, how are you thoughtful about doing racial equity work while being mindful of reducing harm? And so I'll definitely let Susana and Felecia have a chance to answer that. But I also, one thing that we were wondering from all of you is, you know, as they were talking, they were trying to they brought up some conversations, right, about coalition building and working with others. And so we wondered from you all, from the audience, what are some strategies for sustaining and or creating coalitions and solidarity groups from your perspective? And so I'll type that in chat, and please do, as they're talking, think about some ways that you've done it or you've seen it done that's worked. And so Susana, Felecia, anything you want to add? How are you thoughtful about doing racial equity work while being mindful of reducing harm? And Rich, please do feel free to jump in, but should you have something?
So I'll jump in. I think one of the things I try to be mindful of, coming from my own experience, from my marginalized identities, right, and being in spaces where good intentioned people were harmful, is I think often I won't say often, sometimes we go into the work and we're already working, and then we're like, oh, okay, let me also think about mitigating harm, right? We never asked the people we were working with or servicing what is harmful to them. We make assumptions about what is harmful for them. And then we work around what we believe is harmful to them, and could be very well still doing worse harm, right? And so I think a first step is always, one, being in community with the groups that you're working with and finding out from them what has been harmful. Finding out, I mean, sometimes you get resistance from their groups because they have experienced kind of people with savior complexes, or having their voices silenced, having their own work co-opted. And so finding out, like, what does equitable outcomes look like for you, and what has been harmful, what is harmful now, and then kind of starting to develop your work in kind of this more collective, community oriented way. as opposed to going in and being like, yes, we know what you need and we know what's not going to harm you. I think that is the first step to probably doing some harm you didn't expect to do. And so really, I just think some simple steps of kind of like co-creating kind of strategies as opposed and getting information from the actual group that you're trying to avoid harming, so that you're actually know that you're being conscious of the right thing as opposed to what you think you need to be conscious about.
I totally agree. I think, developing all of those strategies that Felecia mentioned, but I also want y'all to just also keep in mind that when harm is caused, what is the repair and reparations that need to happen for that trust to be built? And so I've been in communities and where there's just a lot of mistrust about the university because of what they've all the community knowledge that they've gained is that they harm us. They don't care about us. They come in, they take, and they never give back. And so then there's the conversation of like, okay, like how do we begin to repair? How do we begin to develop transparency, develop trust, develop, co-construct, as Felecia mentioned, sort of what does the reciprocity of relationship look like between two groups. And so I think those conversations in terms of what does that reparations look like and what does that repair look like, it can be a lengthy process because that harm is super entrenched and it's felt, and that's historical knowledge from a community that has had lots of experiences with our universities. But I think it also goes back to the repair and reparations, asking what that looks like.
And I wanted to just, because Susana made me think of something too. When it's expressed to you, right, that this group has experienced harm, right, within a system or from a system, to kind of be thoughtful of how trying to then use that same system to repair the harm may not kind of almost like dismisses what they just shared with you. And I think that we're not always conscious of that. We have so much trust in systems and structures often. And it's like the system and the structures that has already been what has perpetuated the harm. So being mindful that it may not be presenting a new system and structure to repair the harm may not be embraced, right? And understanding that.
I think each of what you're saying, right, it kind of goes back to the title of this, right? Navigating state socio-political context. You got to know who you're serving, and you got to know exactly the systems that work, that don't work. I think that each of you keep pointing to that, and as this next leg of work moves on, that definitely is center to it, right? Knowing whom you're serving and why you're serving, and then obviously going through those systems, either trying to help dismantle them, right, or the ones that are working, reinforcing for our students. And so I love that you all that this is the work that you do. This is what you work to do every day, all day, and this work gets exhausting. It's been nice to have all of you together during when we have our calls, trying to figure out, what's next, what else would help our state leads, and as they're going through their institutions, working with their institutions, doing this work. You'll see here shortly, each of them are writing blogs about different topics. So student transfer, undocumented immigrants, liberatory community college leadership. Each of them have such unique spaces of work that they're doing. And we're going to give that back to you. And one of the ways is also through this webinar, and planning to record a couple other webinars as well for you to think through just a few other topics, right, related to culturally sustaining practices and pathways. But with that, like, this work is tough day in and day out, and we know it, and we readily take it on because there's this hope that we still have, and that's why we continue doing it. And so as we wrap up this panel, wondering, you know, what do you see as the hope? And we talked a little bit about that. Maybe it's even radical hope, right? What do you see that hope as in doing racial equity work? And I will let any of you start off. If someone's feeling it, go for it. Rich, I knew it.
I'm kind of feeling that. So I love that phraseology, because I think, you know, one thing is, it's the beautiful struggle, right, that King talked about, right? So being in communities like this, being in actually what I call restorative resistance, right? You know, being able to resist at a time where you are also doing things that feed your soul, right? You know, and I think it's important to be in community with people, right? So, you know, in your individual institutional context, in your state context, it may feel lonely, but you look at this array of folks across the country doing work, it must feel, you know, you understand there's a greater cause at work, right? And I think really centering self-care in how you go about doing your resistance is super important, right? We all work incredibly hard, right? Make sure you find time to turn the work off, right? And I've actually been challenged many times, like, Rich, you talk a good game, but you're not doing it. So I'm actually kind of taking that on as sort of something I need to start doing more of, which is like literally disconnecting from the work, engaging with things outside of the work, which is always there. It's always going to go away. In fact, on the podcast that I host in Austin, Texas, recently we were talking about the picture of Dr. King in Jamaica in the pool, right? And nobody ever thinks about Martin Luther King, you know, on vacation with his family, but he did that, right? In the middle of the civil rights movement, right? So that just shows you have to do the things to make sure that you're able to be on top of your game, that you feel connected and engaged, and also making sure that there's time to reflect and rest. I think just the sort of spate of what we've seen happening with our Title IX colleagues in the last couple of years, when people are leaving Title IX jobs very quickly, and now what's happening right now with the issues with people working in DEI roles. These are high intense to sort of find a release. Then there's just not a way to do those jobs sustainably. So, you know, I think for self-care, for me, I am a very poor amateur.
And we might have officially lost him. I know. You're like, I want to hold on, but he's frozen and saying it's the Thin Mints. That's funny. Susana or Felecia, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think Richard did kind of hit the, you know, hammer on the nail around like that self-care part. I also, you know, think about this work as that we don't like approach it as like, today I'm, you know, I'm going to solve racism today by doing this. It's about like, how do, you know, like the small ways, right? And the small acts. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be this big wave or big ripple, but it's just those small acts that, you know, add up to that big wave or ripple. I think is thinking about the work in that way. I also think about it in ways of being in community with others, and practicing a lot of gratitude, thinking about my ancestors, thinking about my immigrant experiences, and that always grounds me in terms of like making sure that I'm aligned with my values. But I think this week in particular, like your people, like you know that you're not alone, but you need to have someone, because I know there's sometimes where I was like, I'm about to pop off at somebody right now. I need to go and talk to somebody, because we can't embody that in our bodies, right? I think that's important to understand, is that this and my colleague and I from are doing a special issue about sort of like doing the equity work, but also rooted in wellness, because I feel like this, you know, it gets embodied in our bodies in ways that manifests into things that, you know, cause more serious ailments, you know, within our health and bodies and mental wellness. And so I'm always very mindful of making sure that there's an outlet for me. There's in ways that I do the work. So.
Yeah, so So I feel like I should pay Susana and Rich because I've had my therapy session for today to kind of call me to the carpet on self-care. But I think for me, what's hopeful, and kind of have two sides of the same coin here for me. I think as I look at how the work has been moving, um, what's hopeful to me is that I feel like there's more touch points around equity work than we've ever seen before. I think if we look historically, equity work has been either a small group of people at an institution or it's been a small group of people here. And I think now we're seeing, we're seeing these networks of people. We're seeing I do work with boards. We've never had boards talking about equity before, right? And now they're like, oh, we want to, at least we're trying, right? Or we want to learn more. And I think that is exciting to me and hopeful for me, because I think when you start to have more touch points, when you start to have a larger network, it's harder to squash, right? It's harder to control, it's harder to try and dismantle when it's growing across all these networks and all these spaces and spreading out wider spaces as opposed to concentrated spaces. And so I think that to me is hopeful, because I think the more networks, the stronger the movement towards advancing equity and equitable outcomes in institutions becomes. And I think in addition, kind of related to that, I think we're, as we see every generation become more what I call kind of the multi-hyphenated professional, in which faculty just aren't kind of local traditional faculty anymore. Higher ed professionals aren't kind of just only localized to their institution. Our politicians, our activists, our community organizers, people are not as beholden to spaces as much, or constrained by spaces as much. They have various things in the fire which allow them to be able to move freer in ways that I think historically folks may not have been, whether that is because of technology or just being able to have different accesses to resources, as opposed to like the one thing that somebody could come and take away and really kind of control you with that. And I think that has also allowed us to have a conversation and move in a way that has been helpful. And I think the more we see people kind of getting out of their silos and working across kind of what traditionally we saw as like boundaries and borders, that makes me hopeful. The fact that we're sitting on this Zoom with people from California and from Texas and all over, and everyone does different things, has different kind of expertise, and we're all kind of figuring out how we can learn from each other and work with each other. I don't know that it would have saw it this vast maybe like 30 years ago, right? And so that makes me hopeful. I think the more we engage and work in ways that makes it hard to squash or to control, the further we'll go, and the more impact and the movement will have. And so I'm hopeful, even in the midst of resistance.
That was the best way to end it. Thank you all for joining us. Join me in thanking our equity champions for, I think, yes, it's been a therapy session for all of us, and especially in thinking of ways, right, that we end in self-care and hope, radical hope. And yes, I hope starts off this conversation today well. So with that, we are a little bit over, so we will yield back no time. But thank you all for joining. And just a reminder, if you haven't had your quarterly call with your equity champion consultant, now's the time. Make sure you get that scheduled. So thank you all.